Hello, and welcome back to Cogito Ergo Pod. I'm your host, Daniel. Today we're diving into one of the most fascinating and arguably one of the weirdest optical illusions in the history of art and theology. If you've ever walked through a museum or flipped through a medieval manuscript, you might have seen this figure, Moses, the lawgiver, the prophet, the man who led the Israelites out of Egypt. But in these depictions, he's got something a bit unexpected growing out of his forehead. Two distinct, unmistakable horns. It's a visual that feels jarring to a modern eye. We usually associate horns with the demonic or the beastly. So seeing them on one of the holiest figures in Judeo-Christian history seems like a mistake. And as it turns out, it mostly was. But like all good historical mistakes, the story of the horns of Moses is a tangled web of linguistics, cultural bias, and some very high-stakes translation choices. To understand where these horns come from, we have to go back to the source, the book of Exodus, chapter 34. Moses is coming down from Mount Sinai for the second time, clutching the tablets of the law. The text tells us that his face was transformed by his conversation with God. In the original Hebrew, the word used is qāran. This is where the detective work begins. Qāran is a denominative verb based on the noun qeren, which almost always means horn. However, in this specific context, most modern scholars agree it was meant to describe rays of light or a radiant quality. Essentially, Moses was glowing, but translation is a tricky business. Long before the famous Latin Vulgate, a Greek Jewish scholar named Aquila of Sinop, working around the year 130 CE, translated the term literally as horned. Now, for Aquila, this wasn't necessarily a slight. In the ancient Near East, and much of the Old Testament, horns were symbols of power, strength, and even divine favour. Think of a crown or a helmet. So when Jerome sat down in the late 4th century CE to produce the Latin Vulgate, the version of the Bible that would dominate the West for a millennium, he followed suit. He used the Latin word cornuta. In the Douay Rheims translation of the Vulgate, it reads, "And when Moses came down from the Mount Sinai, he knew not that his face was horned from the conversation of the Lord." Now, did Jerome actually think Moses grew physical horns? It's a bit of a debate. Some argue Jerome was being literal, while others, like the scholar Medjuk, suggest he viewed horned as a metaphor for glorified. In a commentary on Ezekiel, Jerome even noted that Moses' face had become glorified, or as the Hebrew says, horned. He was trying to be faithful to the difficult Hebrew root, perhaps seeing horns of light as a way to describe a divine aura. However, cultural historian Stephen Bertman offers a pricklier theory. Jerome wasn't exactly known for his love of the Jewish people. Bertman suggests Jerome might have made a conscious theological choice. By choosing horns over glorified, a term used in the Greek Septuagint, Jerome avoided making Moses look too much like Jesus. In the New Testament, specifically the book of Revelation, horns start to take on a darker vibe associated with dragons and the Antichrist. By giving Moses horns, Jerome might have been subtly nudging the reader to see the old law as something animalistic or superseded, rather than radiant. For several centuries, this was just a word on a page. But by the 11th century CE, it jumped from the page to the canvas. One of the earliest examples is in the Old English hexachute. The artists weren't necessarily high-level theologians. They were looking at the Old English word geheint and drawing exactly what they saw. From there, the horned Moses took off. You can find him in the stained glass of Chartres, the Sistine Chapel, and Notre Dame. During the Middle Ages, the symbolism was a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, you have positive depictions where the horns represented Moses as a powerful precursor to Christ. But on the other, things got dark. As anti-Jewish sentiment grew, as it often did in the later medieval period, the horns of Moses began to bleed into the horns of the Jew. There was a developing, horrific folklore that Jewish people actually possessed horns. This was reinforced by laws mandating the pileus cornutus, the horned hat, or badges that depicted horn-like shapes. On maps, like the Hereford Mappa Mundi, the horned Moses is presented in a way that scholars like Deborah Strickland argue is overtly anti-Semitic, linking the Exodus to the expulsion of the Jews from England in 1290. In the popular imagination, it became harder and harder to separate the prophet's divine horns from the demonic horns attributed to his descendants. The climax of this tradition is, without a doubt, Michelangelo's Moses, sculpted around 1513. It's a masterpiece. Even Sigmund Freud was obsessed with it, and he had plenty of obsessions. Michelangelo's Moses is powerful and imposing, with two horns crowning a head of thick, swirling hair. It's generally seen as a positive, demotic depiction, mixing the animalistic with the divine to show a man who was literally touched with the presence of God. But Michelangelo was actually at the end of the trend. By the 1500s, Renaissance scholarship was catching up. People were realizing that the Vulgate had perhaps been a bit too literal with its horns. The mistranslation was being called out. Slowly, the horns began to morph. In the Sistine Chapel frescoes from the 1480s, Moses doesn't have horns. Instead, he has two distinct bunches of light rays springing from his head. This became the new standard. You can see it on the Mosesbrunnen fountain in Bern, Switzerland, where the rays are made of gilded metal. Interestingly, once the rays of light idea took hold, artists started getting a bit creative with the timeline. Technically, Moses only started glowing after he met God on Sinai. But by the 19th century, artists like Gustave Doré was giving these rays to an infant Moses in the bulrushes. It became a permanent attribute, like a halo. The horns didn't vanish entirely, though. If you visit the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., you'll find a bronze statue of Moses by Charles Henry Neuhaus from the 1890s. He's still got them, a late, lingering echo of a translation choice made 1,500 years prior. It's a wild thought, isn't it? That a single Hebrew root, qāran, could ripple through time, changing how a prophet looked, influencing how people were persecuted, and challenging some of the greatest artists in history to figure out how to paint glory. Thanks for joining me today on Cogito Ergo Pod. I've been your host, Daniel. If you enjoyed this look into the horned prophet, stay tuned for our next episode where we'll continue to unpick the strange, unusual, and fascinating threads of our collective history in philosophy, religion, the esoteric, and mysticism. Please follow and like this podcast on your preferred podcast platform. Give us a like and a subscribe on YouTube. And also, if you're so inclined, you can find us on TikTok and on Instagram. Thank you, and I'll speak to you again soon.